It's time for Ask the Expert, your chance to learn something new every day. Let's find out who our expert is today.
Well, today on Ask the Expert, Barry Funkhouser here with a special guest. Have you ever thought about joining the Peace Corps? Well, with us today is a notable human to Camarillo, Martina Nicholson. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
So you are a descendant, is that the right word, of the Camarillos?
Yes.
You're the granddaughter of...
I'm the great-granddaughter of Adolfo.
Of Adolfo. Okay.
I'm granddaughter of his daughter, Ave Maria.
So before we get started about your journey going to South America, the new Isabel exhibit is going on at the Camarillo Ranch, and I know you had a chance to check it out, and that was sort of some of the missing pieces of the family history. So can you tell us a little bit about what you learned?
I was really excited that they were able to put on an exhibit, because when they had told me they were going to, I said, nobody knows very much about her. None of us, She died when my mom was 15. So my mom didn't even know her that well. And there wasn't much written about her, except, a few of Adolfo's journals and going to the hospital every night before she died in 1936. So it was just wonderful. And one of the wonderful things to make it happen was that the oldest daughter, Rose, had a daughter named Rosita, and Rosita's son, Tom Marvel, inherited photos from his mom that his grandmother, Rose, had taken when she was a little girl. They gave her a camera for Christmas. So she took some of those pictures of Isabel that none of us had ever seen before. And it was really wonderful because they were in the house. She was happy and, relaxed. It wasn't like just at a big party or something. And so there's a couple of her at Matilaha camping, and then there's a couple of her in the house and with the kids. And so it was just really wonderful to see those pictures. And another one that I loved was her with a grandchild. I think it was the first grandchild. So
it's a lovely addition to the ranch and the story of the Camarillo family and the beginnings of our city. But you, on the other hand, you grew up in Santa Barbara, didn't you?
Well, actually, I grew up in Ventura.
Okay.
And when I was in high school, I went to Santa Barbara to Marymount for high school because my parents thought that I needed more academic discipline and that it would be good for me to go up there. So I came home on weekends, but I really loved being in school there and, really enjoyed my time in high school because of it.
And then something in you decided to join the Peace Corps. And so before you tell us why you decided to join, what is it and how does it help humanity?
So a backstory to that is my mom in college knew John Kennedy's sister, Maria Shriver's mother. And her name was Eunice Kennedy Shriver. And so my mom was always very interested in everything that was going on with the Kennedy family and the Shrivers. And Mr. Shriver, Sergeant Shriver, was the one who was the first head of the Peace Corps. And he was the head of the Peace Corps because when John Kennedy gave his inaugural speech, he said he wanted to make something happen to allow people not to be in a military role to the rest of the world, but in a peacemaking endeavor where people could go and help train other people, teach, do things that Americans knew how to do, but other people in other countries maybe didn't have as much experience with. And by giving that role to all these young people out of college, it made it possible to start bringing American know-how to many rural cultures. So I was in college at Santa Clara in my at the end of my third year, beginning of my senior year. The Peace Corps recruiters came to campus, and my roommate really wanted to be a Peace Corps volunteer, and she asked me if I'd go with her to talk to them. But she had already sent in her application. So in order to do something, they said, well, why don't you apply too? So they helped me fill out the papers, and they made me sound good by saying I was a camp counselor and I had all these skills because my dad was an artist. I knew how to make paper mache things, and you know, and both my parents were teachers, which of course would be a very good lead-in skill. So we sent it off, and I wasn't at the moment thinking I was headed for the Peace Corps, but I thought, well, it's good to send in the application. And then I got accepted. And then they said, you can have this job in Paraguay as a health educator for 2 years. So I left 2 weeks after college to go to South America to be a health educator in Paraguay.
Wow. So when you got there, how did you explain your presence? Because this was sort of a new concept, and news traveled slowly pre-internet times. So
Well,
how did you help the local community and let them know why you were there?
Well, interestingly, because there was a lot of presence in South America since Sergeant Shriver, which was I think it began in 1962, and I was going in 72. So 10 years already had happened, and many Peace Corps volunteers had already come to Paraguay because Paraguay was rural and agricultural, and there were a lot of potential things that people could do to be helpful there. And they were people who liked Americans and wanted to work with Americans. There wasn't a lot of hostility or problems there. There was a dictator running the country who had a very strong hand. And so there was peace. And the Paraguayans used to say, well, this is the price we pay for peace, because before that, there were revolutions and a lot of, shootings and chaos and tough stuff happening. And so they wanted to plant their crops and harvest them. They wanted their kids to go to school, and peace was the necessary first step. So before I got to my town, the girl that was in my town sort of picked me out of the kids coming, and young new Peace Corps volunteers coming down, because she thought I'd be good for my town, that I'd fit well. And in my town, there was a doctor and his wife who were in charge of the little health center. And he was trained by a really wonderful missionary doctor in the capital who was from Johns Hopkins. And he became a very good obstetrician gynecologist type doctor, but family practice doctor also, in this little tiny town. And he set up a clinic, including an operating room, in our town. So when I got there, I said, well, what do you want me to do? So the thing was, they had already had a health educator before who was mostly working in the schools. So I was the first one that was really interested in working with the hospital and trying to give little talks every morning before the patients were seen on different topics like vaccines, keeping your hands clean, reducing infections. Especially the death of children from dysentery was really important in the time I was there. There was no running water. People had wells, and they had an inadequate amount of home septic systems. So what the government did was they made these big cement kind of a platform that you could build a latrine and then put this platform over it to be able to keep it from washing out in the rainy season, and then helping to keep the fecal matter from getting into the water supply, because in the rainy season it was really, really wet and muddy and flooded, and it was very easy for once one of those latrines broke down for the water supply to become contaminated. So one of our jobs was to try to get people to buy those latrine bases and put them in their houses. And then I wrote a little song about hookworms, and we had a little program for the kids in the schools about keeping your shoes on so the hookworms wouldn't get in your feet, because a lot of kids were used to wearing no shoes to school. You'd come in barefoot and then put your shoes on when you got to school. So then the whole time you were walking, there was a risk that the hookworms could get into your feet. And then there was a cycle of anemia. So our Peace Corps doctor and the medical doctors from the country, the Paraguayan public health doctors, worked together to set up this eradication of hookworm program.
Wow, just one of many things I'm sure you had you faced in the early days of health and being in the Peace Corps. So we're speaking with Martina Nicholson today. She was in the Peace Corps, and she's also a descendant of the Camarillos. I always like to call them Camarillians. We're all Camarillians here, us that live in this fine city. But so before you joined the Peace Corps, did you have to learn a bunch of stuff? How did you prepare yourself to leave the country? I mean, you were a young person then, so I'm sure it was pretty scary. You had your college friend as like a, like a safety net, but how did
Well,
that?
well, the thing is that to do health education in Paraguay was not considered like you needed a health degree. You knew enough from just being a person in the regular American world about sanitation and health. And so of course I could read little booklets about vaccines and stuff about different kinds of health programs. But what they wanted from me was the skills of helping the teachers to teach about it. So I made little film strips with plastic and made up stories. There was a little girl with dirty hands and she got sick because she didn't wash her hands. There was a guy who had a cavity in his tooth because he didn't brush his teeth. And then we had a whole big contest about making little latrines and understanding why latrines were important and getting families to put them in their houses and stuff. And then the big song that we sang, my little kids in the town, after I left, the next volunteer, Mary Lou, took them to the Capitol and they sang it on national television. Well, in Paraguay, there were only 2 or 3 channels and it wasn't very much competition. And so everybody in the country learned the song. So 25 years later, I went to a reunion in Washington, D.C., and they go, "Oh, you're the Sevo E person that wrote that song." They all knew it. All the old Peace Corps volunteers for generations after me, they'd all learned that song because of it being on the TV.
Oh,
so it was very sweet.
That's so worth it. Can you sing it to us now? Do you remember it?
Yeah. Sevo E, jaju kake na. Sevo E, hoa no ha hoa pa. E purula sapatu nere sai hangwa. E were coletrina ipotipora. So the little kids would run down the street and they'd be yelling at me, Sevo E, and I'd answer them back, But in terms of learning about living in a foreign country, because I had been my parents were very kind to me and they helped me be able to go to Europe for my junior year in college. So I was in Vienna for a year in the capital of Austria. And I minored in German, I majored in philosophy, and I thought I was going to become a philosophy teacher. But then I got into this Peace Corps thing. But because I had lived somewhere and learned how to live abroad, it wasn't so hard to go to Paraguay and be there. And we had to take enough stuff for a year. And one of the funniest things was you had to take enough Tampax for a year because they didn't have Tampax in Paraguay. So it took up about half the suitcase. That kind of stuff was so funny. And then there was a girl not in my group. My group was the health educator group, but another group was the agricultural team. And the women in that team were supposed to help people plant more vitamin-rich vegetables to add to their diet and help them learn to cook the foods that would taste good so they'd eat them, because otherwise they would just keep doing what they were doing and they would continue to have it was not a starvation that the Paraguayans had. It was a minimal vitamin deficiency that was more subtle than hunger like Africa. So one of the biggest jobs was teaching them palatable food, how to cook it. So she came down with a big pressure cooker. That was what she had in her suitcase. But each one of us, tried to think, what is it that I'm going to need there? And then, of course, we didn't know what we were going to need there. But they kept reassuring us. The main thing was to learn the language and be able to talk to people. And of course, one of the biggest things for me in the summertime, it was really hot. And a lot of Paraguayan moms would wrap their babies very tightly in blankets and they'd get more hot. And so we started telling them, loosen up the blankets, let them be cooler. And then we taught them how to make a substitute for plain water, which you had to boil the water, which they didn't know yet. And so they had to boil the water and then add a tablespoon of sugar and a tablespoon of salt. And that was like making a little bit of an electrolyte balance. It wasn't Gatorade, but the idea of trying to keep the electrolytes in the system if a baby got diarrhea. And so that was a big thing that we did. And then the next thing that I got interested in was trying to help people have babies. And so they helped me learn. And then we had a big class for the midwives in the area because they were untrained. They were doing it voluntarily. It was a time immemorial way of having babies. But the doctor wanted to get them to bring the patients in, get a blood pressure check, make sure they had a tetanus shot because some of the babies had died of umbilical tetanus, and make sure that if they had a complication, they'd bring the patient in before she was dying, and often to be able to help save the baby's life. So we ended up giving a class, and I was a translator from Spanish. He spoke Spanish to Guarani, which was the Indian language that is a native Paraguayan language, in order to get the midwives to come and learn and be attentive to the way it should have been, that there's a backup system for you. And we cut the maternal infant mortality in half in the first year of doing that. So it was really, really wonderful that they responded, they came, they listened, they wanted to learn, and this made it possible for them.
That's real good work you've done, Martina Nicholson, from the Peace Corps. Long ago you were in the Peace Corps. Let me ask you one more thing.
1972 to 1974. 2 years, and then you could up for another year.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much for spending time giving us just a little glimpse of how it is like. I'm sure everyone has cell phones down there now. I wonder what it would be like now. There's
I've
probably
seen pictures because, believe it or not, my family that I lived with then is on Facebook. So they send pictures.
I was
And
going to ask you if you keep touch with anybody
yes,
from then.
and of course, I love to sing. And so I sang with the people that were playing the guitars and the harps. Paraguayan music is harps and guitars usually. And so I know a lot of the songs and I can still sing some of them. And so that's really fun. And it was a wonderful culture. They were wonderful people, warm people. And I felt really happy being with them.
It sounds like it. Okay, one more question before we go. I think you just answered it, though, because it might be music. But is there a specific tradition or perspective from your time there that you took with you back home?
For sure, the music, because, I had a guitar and I used to write music and sing all the time. And so I just slurped up their music too. But I didn't play as well. So, somebody'd start playing and then I could sing along with them. But also, it made it really vivid for me to understand how life on a farm in a rural area is. And I really felt like when I came home that I understood Camarillo better because of that experience of, being in a rural place where, people were in ox carts, on horseback, only one paved road. Most of the roads weren't paved and they would close them when it rained. There was a different pace of life because of that. And most people didn't leave the town or go away and come back. It was rare then. It's more easy now for kids to go into the capital and get trained in different things. And they have asphalted roads and they have phones and they have, electricity. And when I was there, they were still building the Itaipu Dam, which was a huge dam on the Iguazu Falls water, which was between Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. And Paraguay, by letting that dam be built on their land, it allowed them to get electricity. So they were one of the first countries in South America to have adequate amounts of electricity to do developmental things. And so, there was a lot going on. There were people there that were teaching farming skills, different kinds, people who were doing, the men in our health education group, they were doing sanitation. So they were helping put in water supplies that were protected from, the unsanitary ground. They had pipes. They had, big tanks in the Midwest where the water's up high and, all of that kind of stuff. So when I started, most houses didn't have running water. But as time went on, they got pipes and running water and sanitation systems. So now it much more looks like it does in maybe rural Mexico a little bit, but it's much more like middle-class American life, the way people live. When I first went there, they were cooking over open fires outside their houses in, some of them. And there weren't that many people that had a generator or even a propane tank. They would just use pieces of wood, cook their breakfast on that, So it was like 100 years ago here, or 150 years ago.
Yeah, looking at the building blocks of community, the ground floor of community. You had a front row seat to that.
Yes.
In both situations, in your family life and on your adventures. So thank you for sharing today.
Thank you very much for having me.